Hello, my name is Jonathan. I am a writer and a storyteller. I hope you enjoy the journey I have written for you today. So get cozy and relax. It is funny how you never really notice the noise until it is gone. How the city screams at you from the moment you wake up at 6 a.m. until you close your eyes at midnight. Excuse me. Living in this city for 70 years does that to a man. Fills your lungs with dust and your ears with a constant ringing hum that never quite fades away. Walking down 42nd Street that Tuesday, the heat was already rising off the pavement in shimmering waves. Distortions that made the yellow taxis look like they were melting right into the asphalt. My knees were aching, a dull throb that always told me when a storm was coming or when I had just pushed myself too hard. And today it was definitely the latter. Just trying to get to the pharmacy on 3rd Avenue felt like a military expedition, fighting against a tide of tourists and businessmen who looked at me like I was just another obstacle in their race to get nowhere fast. The humidity was the worst part, sticking my shirt to my back, making the air feel thick enough to chew on. Passing a construction site on the corner, the sound of a jackhammer tearing into the concrete felt like it was rattling my own teeth in my skull, a violent rhythmic pounding that made my head spin. Needs to stop. That was the only thought looping through my mind. Just a desperate plea for everything to just hold still for 1 second. Turning the corner to escape the dust cloud from the construction, I found myself in a narrow alleyway, one of those forgotten slivers of the city between two towering brick buildings where the sun barely reached the ground. It was quieter here, but the smell of old garbage and stale water was sharp enough to make your eyes water. Leaning against the rough brick wall to catch my breath, my chest heaving, I looked down at the ground, trying to steady the world that was tilting slightly to the left. That was when I saw it. Half buried in a pile of wet cardboard and grime, something glinted. A dull flash of silver that didn't look like a soda can or a candy wrapper. Bending down, my joints popping with the effort, I reached out and brushed the dirt away with my thumb. It was a pocket watch, heavy, heavier than any watch had a right to be, cold to the touch despite the 90-degree heat of the afternoon. It wasn't digital, nothing modern about it, just a solid piece of tarnished silver with no brand name, no markings, just a single dial on the face and a button on the top that looked worn smooth by 1,000 thumbs before mine. Rubbing the face of it on my sleeve, the glass revealed a strange set of hands, 3 of them, all stopped at 12 o'clock perfectly. Holding it felt strange, like holding a magnet that was pulling at the iron in my blood. Standing up straight, I looked at the thing, feeling a weird compulsion, a gut feeling that this wasn't just trash someone had tossed aside. The noise from the main street was still pouring into the alley, sirens wailing in the distance, the rumble of the subway beneath the grate at my feet, the shouting of a vendor selling hot dogs. It was a chaotic symphony that made my headache spike, a sharp pain right behind my eyes. Just stop, I muttered to the empty alley, my thumb hovering over the button on the top of the watch. Just give me a minute. My thumb pressed down. The button didn't click. It crunched. A heavy mechanical sound like a lock sliding into place inside a vault. And then the sound died. Not faded, not lowered, but cut, instantly, like someone had severed the wire to a speaker. The siren that had been wailing was gone. The hum of the subway vanished. The shouting voices were silenced. Stumbling back, I nearly dropped the watch, clutching it to my chest as I looked around wildly. The dust motes dancing in the shaft of light coming from the street were frozen, hanging in the air like tiny stars trapped in amber. A rat that had been scurrying along the base of the wall was caught mid-stride, one paw raised, its tail stiff as a wire behind it. Stepping out of the alley and back onto the main street was the hardest thing I have ever done, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The scene before me was impossible. A bicycle courier was suspended at a 45-degree angle, turning a sharp corner, his face twisted in concentration, the tires kicking up grit that hung solid in the air. A pigeon was frozen 3 feet above a man's head, wings fully spread, looking like a taxidermy display suspended on invisible wires. Walking up to a woman who had dropped her purse, I saw the contents spilling out: a lipstick, a set of keys, a handful of coins, all hovering inches above the sidewalk, waiting for gravity that was no longer there. I waved my hand in front of her face. Nothing. No blink, no breath. Her eyes were fixed on a point in the distance, glassy and still. Is this a stroke? I asked myself, speaking aloud just to hear something, anything. My voice sounded flat, dead, barely traveling 3 feet before the air swallowed it up. But I could move. I could breathe. I reached out and poked the suspended bicycle wheel. It felt hard as rock, immovable, locked in time. I pushed harder. Nothing. It was anchored to reality with a strength I couldn't comprehend. Looking down at the watch in my hand, the 3 hands were still at 12 o'clock, but the second hand was vibrating, just slightly. A tiny tremor that told me the machine was working hard to hold the world in place. I was alone. In a city of 8 million people, I was the only ghost haunting the graveyard. Fear has a strange way of turning into curiosity, especially when the danger doesn't actually move. Standing there on the corner of 42nd and Broadway, the initial panic in my chest began to settle into something else, a feeling I hadn't felt since I was a boy, sneaking into the abandoned rail yard. The world was my toy box. Tentatively, I reached out to a floating newspaper that had been blown out of a man's hand. My fingers wrapped around the paper, and the moment I applied force, it moved. It crinkled. It was soft again. It seemed that whatever I touched, whatever I truly focused on, woke up for me, joining my timeline while everything else stayed asleep. A grin spread across my face, stretching skin that hadn't smiled in years. I wasn't just a ghost anymore. I was a god. The bank on Fifth Avenue was a fortress of marble and gold, a place I had only ever entered to deposit my meager pension checks, while security guards looked at me with suspicion. Today, the revolving door was stuck, frozen mid-spin, so I had to squeeze through the gap, my coat brushing against the cold glass. Inside, the silence was heavy, thick with the scent of polished wood and old money. The guard, a young man who usually stood by the velvet ropes with a stern face, was frozen in the middle of a yawn, his mouth wide open, eyes squeezed shut in a moment of pure boredom that was now preserved for eternity. Walking past him felt like a transgression, a violation of the natural order. But my feet kept moving toward the vault. The vault door wasn't open, of course, but the teller stations were unprotected. Behind the counter, a woman was frozen in the act of counting a stack of cash, her fingers blurred slightly at the edges where the motion had been fastest. Reaching over the glass partition, I plucked a bundle of hundreds from her hand. It slid out easily, crisp and cool. I didn't need the money. Shops were closed. Bills didn't matter when time didn't pass. But the feeling of holding it, of stuffing a wad of cash into my pocket just because I could, was intoxicating. I took another bundle, then another, filling my pockets until they bulged, laughing softly into the silence of the grand hall. It was childish, reckless, and absolutely wonderful. Leaving the bank, the heat of the street hit me again, but I didn't care. I walked right down the center line of the road, weaving between frozen buses and luxury sedans. I saw a red convertible, top down, looking like a cherry dropped in a bowl of gray oatmeal. The driver was a man in sunglasses, looking frustrated at the traffic that would never move again. I climbed onto the hood of his car, sitting there with my legs dangling over the headlights, watching the frozen steam rising from a manhole cover nearby. For the first time in decades, I wasn't rushing. I wasn't late. I had nowhere to be. The city that had been trying to crush me for 70 years was finally, obediently, still. By the time my stomach rumbled, I decided I deserved the best. The Plaza Hotel was only a few blocks up. Marching through the lobby, past frozen bellhops, carrying luggage that defied gravity, I took the stairs, unable to use the elevator since the electricity seemed to be paused, along with everything else. It was a long climb to the penthouse, my old knees popping with every step, but the reward was worth it. Room 808. The door was unlocked. Entering the suite, I found a room service cart parked by the window, laden with a silver tray. Lifting the metal lid, I found a steak, still steaming, trapped in the exact second it was perfect. I sat by the window, eating the best meal of my life, looking down at Central Park, which looked like a green painting, static and beautiful. I poured a glass of wine that hung in the bottle like jelly until I shook it into the glass. I raised a toast to the frozen city, to the silence, and to the strange, heavy watch sitting on the velvet tablecloth beside me. I thought this could last forever. I really did. Comfort makes you careless. That is the hard truth of it. Leaning back in that velvet chair, tipsy on expensive wine and feeling like the king of a silent world, I went to check the time on the silver watch, forgetting for a split second that time didn't exist anymore. My fingers were slick with grease from the steak, and as I lifted the heavy metal disc, it slipped. Watching it fall felt like the only slow-motion thing in a world that was already paused. It tumbled end over end, hitting the marble floor of the penthouse suite with a sound that cracked through the silence like a gunshot. The back of the watch popped open, spilling tiny brass gears across the floor, sending them skittering under the sofa and the table. My heart stopped. I mean, it literally felt like it seized up in my chest. Scrambling down onto my hands and knees, ignoring the sharp pain in my lower back, I frantically gathered the pieces, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp the tiny screws. The main casing was dented, a nasty gash in the silver side, but the button was still there. Desperately, my thumb mashed against the silver plunger, pressing it once, twice, a dozen times in rapid succession. Nothing. The silence remained absolute. The pigeon outside the window was still stuck in the sky. The dust motes in the sunbeam hadn't moved an inch. "Come on," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Don't do this to me." But the machine was dead, a broken toy in the hands of a foolish old man. I tried to force the gears back in, jamming them into the mechanism with clumsy thumbs, but they wouldn't fit, the delicate teeth bent and useless. Sitting back on my heels, surrounded by the wreckage of my own freedom, a cold realization washed over me. I couldn't unfreeze time. I was stuck here. That was when the air started to feel wrong. At first, it was just a stuffiness, like a room that hadn't been aired out in years. But quickly, it became something worse. Gasping for air, I realized that because the air molecules weren't moving, I was sitting in a cloud of my own exhaled carbon dioxide. The fresh oxygen wasn't circulating to me. I had to move to it. Stumbling to my feet, I walked across the room, taking a deep gulp of air near the door, and it tasted sweet, distinct, like drinking from a fresh spring. But the moment I stopped moving, the invisible bubble of bad air began to form around my head again. I had to keep moving, just to breathe. Every few seconds, I had to step forward, effectively eating my way through the atmosphere, just to keep my lungs filled. Then came the heat. The sun, that beautiful golden orb hanging over Central Park, was no longer a light source. It was a laser beam. Without the rotation of the Earth to move the sun across the sky, and without the wind to disperse the heat, the solar radiation was piling up in one spot, baking the city like a clay pot in a kiln. The window glass was radiating heat like a furnace door. Touching it burned my fingertips instantly. The temperature in the suite, which had been a comfortable 70 degrees, was climbing rapidly. 75, 80, 85. Sweat began to pour down my face, stinging my eyes, but it wouldn't evaporate properly because the air was so saturated and still. I was cooking. I was literally cooking in a luxury suite, surrounded by expensive wine I couldn't enjoy, and food I couldn't taste because my mouth was dry as sand. I had to get out. I had to fix this. My mind raced back to the only place that made sense. A small, cluttered shop I'd passed 1,000 times but never entered. The Clockwork Fix. It was all the way uptown near 110th Street. That was over 50 blocks away. 50 blocks of trekking through a city that was rapidly becoming uninhabitable. 50 blocks of dodging frozen cars and smashing through heat bubbles, all while carrying the broken pieces of the only thing that could save me. Grabbing a pillowcase from the bed, I scooped up every single gear, every screw, every shard of silver glass, and tied it to my belt. The journey wasn't just a walk anymore. It was a race against a sun that wouldn't set and air that wouldn't flow. Opening the hotel room door, the hallway air felt cooler, but I knew the street would be a nightmare. I took a deep breath, stepped into the corridor, and began the long march toward salvation. Stepping out of the Plaza Hotel was like stepping into the mouth of a blast furnace. The air on Fifth Avenue wasn't just hot, it was angry, vibrating with a stored energy that had nowhere to go. Shielding my eyes against the glare, the sun felt heavy, pressing down on the top of my head with a weight that made my knees buckle. The silence was different now. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was menacing, a heavy blanket of quiet that amplified the sound of my own ragged breathing. Moving forward was the only option, but the sidewalk was a minefield of statues. A crowd of tourists had been crossing the street when I pressed the button, and now they formed an impenetrable wall of flesh and fabric, hard as granite. Squeezing between a man and a woman who were frozen mid-laugh felt like crushing myself between two stone pillars, their clothes stiff and unyielding against my ribs, scraping my skin like sandpaper. Navigation became a puzzle of angles and gaps. Trying to cut across the street, I ran into a traffic jam of yellow taxis, bumper to bumper, locking the road in a grid of metal. Climbing over the hood of a sedan, the metal seared my palms, hot enough to blister skin in seconds. Pulling my hand back, I saw the red, angry welt forming instantly. The heat wasn't dissipating, it was accumulating in the metal, turning every car into a radiator set to maximum. I had to rip a piece of fabric from a frozen shopper's coat, wrapping it around my hand just to scramble over the burning wreckage of the traffic jam. Dropping down onto the other side, my boots hit the asphalt, which was soft, sticky, turning into a black goo that grabbed at my soles, trying to glue me to the spot. Thirst became a panic, a clawing sensation in my throat that made it hard to swallow. Spotting a hot dog cart on the corner of 59th Street, hope flared in my chest. A bottle of water was sitting on the counter, uncapped, a stream of water frozen in the act of being poured into a cup. Rushing over, I grabbed the bottle, tilting my head back to catch the liquid, but nothing happened. The water hung there, a solid, clear sculpture. Desperately, I tried to bite the water, to suck it out, but it had the consistency of thick rubber, fighting against gravity and suction. I had to physically pull a chunk of water out with my fingers, forcing the gelatinous blob into my mouth and chewing it until my body heat melted it enough to swallow. It was terrifying, fighting basic physics just to get a drink, choking on a liquid that refused to flow. By the time I reached 72nd Street, the strategy had to change. Walking in the sunlight was suicide. The direct rays were heating my clothes until they felt like they were ironing my skin. I began to move like a thief, darting from the shadow of one building to the shadow of another, tracing a zigzag path through the city. Inside the shadows, the air was stagnant and suffocating, but at least it wasn't boiling. My vision was tunneling, the edges of the world turning gray and fuzzy. Every time I stopped to rest, the carbon dioxide cloud formed around my face, choking me, forcing me to stand up and stumble forward again. It was a cruel irony. Forced to keep moving when all I wanted to do was lie down and sleep. But sleep meant death. The bag of watch parts bumped against my hip with every step, a rattling reminder of the mistake I had to fix. Then I saw the fire. A few blocks up, near the museum, a construction crew had been welding something when time stopped. The sparks were frozen in the air, a beautiful, deadly shower of orange stars. But the heat from the torch had continued to build up in that single point of space. As I got closer, the air around the frozen torch wasn't just hot, it was warping, the light bending around a sphere of pure, concentrated energy. It looked like a miniature sun born on the sidewalk. If I walked through that invisible heat bubble, I would incinerate instantly. I had to go around, way around, forcing me to detour through the park, through the tall grass that stood still as spikes, hoping that the shade of the trees would be enough to keep me alive for 10 more blocks. Central Park was no sanctuary. It was a labyrinth of sharp edges. The grass, usually soft underfoot, was frozen into stiff, green needles that crunched like dry pasta with every step, scratching at my ankles through my socks. Birds were suspended in the low branches, their beaks open in songs that would never be heard, looking like decorations in a macabre display case. Dragging my feet, the numbness in my legs was beginning to spread upwards, a tingling warning that my body was shutting down, that the heat was finally winning the argument against my will to live. Emerging onto 110th Street, the familiar facade of the Clockwork Fix appeared like a mirage shimmering in the heat haze, its dusty window cluttered with old clocks that, for once, were all telling the correct time, simply because time itself had given up. Stumbling across the street, dodging a frozen delivery truck that was permanently double-parked, I reached the door of the shop only to find the one thing I hadn't counted on. A sign. A small cardboard sign hanging on the inside of the glass that read, "Back in 5 minutes." 5 minutes. A lifetime in a world where a second never passes. I grabbed the handle, twisting it with sweaty, slick palms. But the lock held fast, solid and unyielding. The shop was a fortress. Looking around for a rock, a brick, anything heavy, my eyes landed on a loose cobblestone near the gutter. Bending down to pick it up sent a wave of dizziness through my head so strong I almost blacked out, the world spinning in a sickening circle before steadying again. Gripping the stone with both hands, I swung it against the door's glass panel with every ounce of strength I had left. The sound was a dull thud, not a crash, as the glass shattered but didn't fall. The spiderweb cracks spread instantly, and the shards broke apart, but they hung there, suspended in the frame like a jigsaw puzzle that someone had glued into the air. I had created a wall of razor blades. To get inside, I couldn't just step over the broken glass. I had to push through it. Using the stone, I battered the center of the web, knocking the floating shards inward, creating a tunnel through the sharp debris. The pieces drifted slowly, reluctantly, moving only when the stone made contact, spinning in the air with deadly grace. Climbing through was a nightmare. Hoisting my leg over the sill, my coat caught on a jagged triangle of glass hovering in midair. Tearing free, I felt a sharp sting on my cheek as a floating splinter sliced the skin. Blood didn't run. It beaded up on the surface of my skin, perfectly round red pearls that refused to drop. Squeezing my shoulders through the gap, I felt the glass snagging my clothes, scratching my arms, 100 tiny cuts burning all at once. Falling onto the dusty floor of the shop, I rolled away from the floating minefield of the window, gasping for air that smelled of old oil and brass. It was cooler in here, the shadows of the shop providing the first real relief I had felt in hours. Lying on the floorboards, I wanted to stay there, to just close my eyes and let the darkness take me. But the watch parts in the pillowcase at my belt rattled, a metallic reminder of the job that wasn't done. Pulling myself up using the edge of the counter, my hands shaking uncontrollably, I looked at the workbench. It was covered in tools, tiny screwdrivers, magnifiers, and tweezers. This was it, the operating table. Untying the pillowcase, I dumped the wreckage of the watch onto the velvet mat. The gears spilled out, a chaotic mess of brass and silver. My vision was swimming, the edges blurring black. But I knew I had to be precise. One mistake, one lost screw, and I would be a permanent resident of this silent, dusty tomb. The workbench lamp wasn't working, obviously, so I had to drag the table closer to the shattered window, using the harsh, unmoving sunlight to see the damage. Spread out on the black velvet mat, the inner workings of the watch looked like the skeleton of a tiny, metallic beast. Picking up the mainspring with the tweezers, my heart sank. A cold, heavy feeling in the pit of my stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. The spring was snapped, clean in two. No amount of glue or prayer was going to fix a stress fracture like that. And without the mainspring, the energy from the button press had nowhere to go. The watch was dead. I stared at the broken metal, the silence of the shop pressing in on my ears, realizing that I had walked 50 blocks, bled, and nearly cooked myself alive just to stare at a piece of junk I couldn't repair. But this was a clock shop. Turning around, I looked at the walls, really looked at them for the first time. They were covered, floor to ceiling, with timepieces of every era. Cuckoo clocks from the Black Forest, sleek modern quartz wall clocks, heavy brass maritime chronometers, and tall, imposing grandfather clocks standing like sentinels in the shadows. Somewhere in this museum of frozen time, there had to be a spring that matched. There had to be. Stumbling away from the table, I began the frantic search, pulling clocks off the wall and smashing them open. Subtlety was gone now. I didn't have the time or the steady hands to unscrew the back panels. I grabbed a heavy brass paperweight and brought it down on the face of a mantel clock. The glass cracked, staying in place until I peeled it away with my fingers, ignoring the fresh cuts on my thumbs. Too big. The spring inside the mantel clock was massive, a thick coil of steel that would never fit inside my pocket watch. I threw the clock aside, watching it float in the air where it left my hand, spinning slowly in zero gravity before drifting toward the corner. I moved to the next one. A delicate carriage clock, gold-plated, looking expensive. Smash. Too small. The gears were microscopic, useless. Panic began to rise in my throat again, tasting like bile. The air in the shop was getting warmer, the heat from the street slowly creeping in through the broken window, and my chest was heaving, trying to pull oxygen from the stagnant room. I was destroying history, smashing centuries of craftsmanship, leaving a trail of floating debris behind me, a cloud of broken glass and wood that I had to swim through to get to the next shelf. Then I saw it. Tucked away in the back corner, covered in a layer of dust that looked like gray fur, was a pocket watch display case. Inside sat a row of antique railway watches, the kind conductors used to use on the Union Pacific back in the 19th century. They were heavy, robust, built to the same scale as the cursed silver thing in my pocket. The display case was locked. I didn't care. I drove my elbow through the glass, the pain barely registering anymore, and grabbed the first one. It felt right. The weight was similar. Pry in the back open with the edge of the tweezers. The mechanism was exposed. It was different, simpler, but the mainspring looked like a match. It was the same width, the same temper of steel. Extracting the donor part was a nightmare. My hands were shaking so bad from the heat stroke that the tweezers kept clicking against the metal, making tiny, sharp sounds that seemed deafening in the quiet. I had to unscrew the bridge holding the spring in place, but the screw was rusted, fused by time and neglect. Applying pressure, I felt the screwdriver slip, gouging a deep scratch into the brass plate and nearly stabbing my own palm. "Easy," I whispered to myself. "Easy now." Taking a deep breath of the stale, dusty air, I tried again, putting my entire body weight into the tiny turn. With a sharp crack, the rust gave way. The screw turned. I lifted the spring out, a perfect, unbroken spiral of potential energy. Now came the hard part. I had to carry this tiny, fragile lifeline back to the workbench, through the floating minefield of debris I had created, and perform a transplant that would make a brain surgeon sweat. Victory is a cruel thing when it is snatched away at the last second. Holding the donor spring in the tweezers, my hands shaking like leaves in a gale, I lowered it into the casing of the silver watch. It was a perfect fit. The geometry was exact, but when I tried to seat the central pin, it wouldn't click. It wouldn't budge. Pushing harder, risking snapping the delicate steel, I realized the problem wasn't size, it was friction. The central shaft of the watch, the part that connected the button to the gears, was seized tight, fused by decades of sitting in the dirt and grime of the gutter. I could replace every gear in the world, but if that central pin didn't turn, the button would never work, and I would never wake up. I needed oil. Not the delicate, thin oil used for clocks, but something aggressive, something that could eat through rust and grime in seconds. I needed industrial solvent, the kind that smells like chemicals and burns your nose. "Think," I muttered, the words sounding loud and foreign in the silent shop. "Where do you get solvent?" My mind, sluggish from the heat, dredged up a memory. Miller's Auto Repair. It was on 112th Street, just 2 blocks north. They would have cans of penetrating oil, degreasers, the heavy-duty stuff used to loosen rusted bolts on old engines. 2 blocks. It didn't sound like far, but in this furnace, it felt like a marathon. Looking at the workbench, I felt a sudden, irrational spike of paranoia. I couldn't leave the watch here. What if someone took it? The thought was insane. Everyone in the world was frozen statues, but the fear was real. A primal instinct to protect the only thing that mattered. Scooping the disassembled parts back into the pillowcase, I tied it to my belt again, feeling the sharp edges of the gears poking into my hip. That was when I heard it. A scuff. The distinct sound of a shoe dragging on the floorboards behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to see the shop owner standing there, angry and unfrozen. But there was nothing. Just the rows of clocks, the dust motes hanging in the air, and a coat rack standing in the corner, draped in a trench coat. "You are losing it, old man," I whispered, wiping sweat from my eyes. But staring at the coat rack, I could have sworn it moved. Just an inch, just a shift in the fabric. I stared at it for a full minute, waiting, daring it to move again. It didn't. It was just a coat, just a trick of the light and a brain that was starving for oxygen. But the feeling of being watched, of eyes boring into the back of my skull, settled over me like a cold shroud. I had to get out of the shop. The silence inside was louder than the street. Stepping back through the broken window, the heat hit me again, a physical blow that nearly knocked me down. The sun had not moved, not even a fraction of a degree. It was still pinning me to the pavement. Stumbling toward 112th Street, the world began to look wrong. The shadows of the buildings seemed to be stretching, elongating in ways that physics shouldn't allow. A fire hydrant looked like it was breathing, expanding and contracting in the corner of my eye, but when I looked directly at it, it was stone still. Hallucinations, I told myself, forcing my feet to move one in front of the other. Heat stroke. Just get the oil. Just get the oil. The heat was warping the air so badly that the buildings looked like they were breathing. Brick walls seemed to expand and contract, rhythmic and slow, like the city was trying to suck the little remaining oxygen out of the atmosphere. Dragging my feet toward 112th Street, the sensation of being followed grew from a suspicion into a certainty. It wasn't a sound, because there was no sound, but a pressure on the back of my neck. Glancing up at the skyline, squinting against the blinding white sun, I saw it. A shape. A dark, blurry figure standing on the edge of a rooftop 10 stories up. It wasn't frozen like the rest. It was swaying. I blinked hard, trying to clear the sweat and grit from my eyes, telling myself it was just a chimney, just a shadow cast by the relentless sun. But when I looked back, the rooftop was empty. The thing had moved. Panic is a cold spike in a hot world. I started to shuffle faster, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Just heat," I muttered, my tongue feeling swollen and heavy. Just the brain cooking. But the corners of my vision were filling with them now. shadows darting between the frozen cars, wisps of black smoke that vanished when I turned my head. It felt like the stillness of the world was waking up demons in my own mind, manifestations of the guilt I felt for breaking time. Passing a bus stop, I flinched violently as a woman's scarf, frozen in mid-flap, looked like a hand reaching out to grab my throat. I swatted at it, hitting nothing but stiff fabric, nearly losing my balance and falling onto the scorching sidewalk. The garage door of Miller's Auto Repair was open, a dark, gaping mouth in the bright brick wall. The smell hitting me was a mix of old rubber, grease, and gasoline, a sharp chemical tang that cut through the humidity. Stumbling inside, the sudden darkness was blinding. My eyes, adjusted to the screaming brightness of the street, went pitch black. I couldn't see a thing. I was blind, dizzy, and convinced that the swaying thing from the roof was standing right behind me in the dark. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The silence that answered was heavy, waiting. Groping blindly, my hands brushed against a cold metal shelf, feeling the shapes of oil cans, wrenches, and spare parts. I had to find a light. I had to find the oil. I had to stop the shadows from catching me. Darkness is a heavy thing when you have been staring at the sun for 3 hours. Standing inside the garage, my eyes refused to adjust, leaving me swimming in a pool of ink. My hands were out in front of me, trembling violently, brushing against cold steel chains and hanging fan belts that felt like dead snakes suspended from the ceiling. The smell of the place was overpowering, a thick cocktail of old motor oil, stale tobacco, and the metallic tang of rust that coated the back of my throat like soot. I coughed, the sound exploding in the enclosed space, echoing off the concrete walls and coming back to me distorted, like a mockery. "Oil," I whispered, the words scraping out of my dry throat. "Just find the oil." I shuffled forward, my boots scuffing on the concrete, kicking aside loose washers and bolts that skittered away into the blackness with terrifying rattles. To my left, a shape began to resolve itself from the gloom. It was a workbench, cluttered with the debris of a mechanic's life. I ran my hands over it, feeling the rough texture of sandpaper, the cold, smooth curve of a wrench, the sticky residue of grease. My fingers closed around a can. I lifted it, shaking it. Empty. The rattle of the ball bearing inside mocked me. I threw it aside, hearing it clang against a tire rim somewhere in the dark. My head was spinning, a carousel of lights and nausea. The heat from the street was bleeding in through the open door, but in here the air was cold and clammy, a tomb sealed off from the burning world outside. I needed the solvent. I needed to fix the watch. But my brain was starting to betray me, whispering that maybe it didn't matter. Maybe I should just lie down on this oil-stained floor and let the silence win. Then I saw him. In the far corner, illuminated by a single shaft of light cutting through a crack in the roof, a man was standing by a hydraulic lift. He was wearing blue coveralls, his back to me, holding a tire iron frozen in mid-swing. My heart stopped. It wasn't just a mechanic. The slope of the shoulders, the way the hair curled over the collar. It looked like Arthur. My Arthur. My brother who had been dead for 10 years. "Artie?" I called out, my voice sounding small and pathetic. "Artie, is that you?" I took a step forward, drawn to the figure like a moth to a flame. The logical part of my brain screamed that it was a stranger, just a frozen stranger. But the heat stroke had melted my logic. I needed to see a face. I needed to tell someone, anyone, what I had done. "I didn't mean to break it, Artie," I mumbled, stumbling over a jack stand, catching myself on the edge of a car hood. "I just wanted a minute. You know how it is. The noise. The constant, grinding noise. It never stops. They always want something. The bills, the doctors, the landlord. They just keep coming." I reached out, my hand hovering inches from the blue fabric of his shirt. "I just wanted to sit down. I just wanted to drink a cup of coffee without feeling like I was running out of time. And now look. Now I have all the time in the world, and I'm burning in hell." I waited for him to turn around, to laugh at me, to tell me I was a foolish old man who should have been careful what he wished for. But he didn't move. He was a statue, a monument to my mistake. I grabbed his shoulder, needing him to be real, needing him to wake up. The fabric was stiff as board. The body underneath was hard as stone. I spun him around. It wasn't Arthur. It was a stranger, a young kid with grease on his face, eyes wide with surprise, mouth open in a shout that would never be heard. The disappointment hit me harder than the heat. I fell back, crashing into a metal shelf. The shelf rattled, and something fell from the top tier, hitting me on the shoulder before clattering to the floor. I looked down. It was a can. A red and yellow can with a straw taped to the side. Penetrating catalyst. Industrial solvent. I grabbed the can, clutching it like a holy relic. This was it, the key. But as I scrambled to get up, the shadows in the corner of the garage seemed to detach themselves from the wall. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were tall, thin shapes stretching toward me. My mind broke. I didn't care if they were real or not. I wasn't staying to find out. I scrambled to my feet, my knees popping, and ran. I ran toward the rectangle of blinding white light that was the door, clutching the can of oil to my chest, leaving the frozen stranger and the ghosts of my past behind in the dark. Bursting back out onto 112th Street, the light was a physical hammer blow. I fell to my knees on the sidewalk, gasping for air. But the air was gone. The atmosphere was thinning. The heat had expanded the gases, pushing the oxygen up and away, leaving me down here in the soup. I looked at the watch parts hanging from my belt. They were hot, burning my hip through my pants. I had the oil. I had the parts. But I had to get back to the shop. 2 blocks. Just 2 blocks back to the workbench. But looking down the street, the pavement rippled. Not a hallucination this time. A crack, a hairline fracture in the asphalt, appeared right in front of my boot. Then another. The earth was cracking. Without gravity and rotation holding it together perfectly, the stress was tearing the city apart. The ground beneath my boots didn't just shake, it groaned. A deep subterranean vibration that I felt in my teeth before I saw the cracks. Sprinting down 112th Street, the world was coming unglued. A mailbox 5 feet away didn't fall over. It lifted, tearing free from the concrete roots and drifting upward into the burning sky like a helium balloon made of blue steel. Gravity was failing. The mass of the earth wasn't holding on to things the way it should, and my own steps turned into terrifying, bounding leaps, sending me 6 feet into the air with every stride. Clutching the can of oil to my chest, I had to grab onto lamp posts and parking meters to pull myself back down, hand over hand, swimming through the thick, superheated air toward the shop. The silence was finally broken, not by sound, but by the tearing of metal and stone, a visual cacophony of a city disintegrating into the void. Reaching the broken window of the Clockwork Fix, the shop was a disaster zone in zero gravity. The thousands of clocks I had smashed, the glass shards, the wooden cases, they were all floating in a chaotic cloud, a swirling nebula of debris that filled the room. Pushing off the doorframe, I floated through the center of the mess, batting away floating gears and splinters that spun lazily in the air. My workbench was vibrating, the heavy iron legs chattering against the floorboards, which were starting to warp and buckle. I slammed the can of solvent onto the table, holding it down with one hand, while my other hand fished the silver watch casing from my pocket. This was it. The air in the room was so thin now that black spots were dancing permanently in my vision, my lungs gasping for oxygen that just wasn't there. I had seconds, maybe a minute, before I passed out and floated away into the stratosphere. With trembling fingers, I jammed the red straw of the oil can into the seized mechanism of the central pin. I didn't measure. I didn't be careful. I sprayed, dousing the delicate silver in a flood of foul-smelling chemical foam. The smell was acrid, burning my nostrils, but I watched as the black gunk around the pin began to dissolve, bleeding out like ink. "Turn!" I hissed, grabbing the tiny rusted shaft with the tweezers. "Please, just turn!" I applied pressure. The metal groaned. My vision went black for a second, my heart fluttering like a dying bird. Then, with a microscopic pop, the pin rotated. It was free. I dropped the donor spring into place, the steel coil slotting home perfectly. I slammed the back casing on, not bothering with the screws, just squeezing it shut with a grip of pure desperation until it snapped into place. The shop gave a violent lurch, the floor tilting at a 45-degree angle. The workbench slid away, knocking me backward into the floating cloud of broken clocks. Tumbling through the air, I clutched the watch, my thumb finding the button on top. The roof of the shop tore open, peeling back like a sardine can, revealing the blinding, burning white sky. I was floating up, drifting toward the hole, toward the vacuum. I screamed, a soundless cry in the dying atmosphere, and mashed my thumb down on the button with everything I had left. Crack! The sound was instantaneous and deafening, a thunderclap that hit me in the chest like a sledgehammer. The air rushed back in, a violent wind that slammed me down onto the floorboards with a bone-jarring thud. I lay there, curled in a ball, as the roar of the city washed over me. The sound of a car horn, the rumble of a truck, the shouting of a pedestrian cursing at the traffic. It was the loudest, ugliest, most beautiful noise I had ever heard. The gravity was heavy, crushing me into the dust, and I welcomed it. I breathed in deep, sucking in lungfuls of dirty, exhaust-filled New York air, crying and laughing at the same time while the dust settled around me. I don't know how long I lay there. An hour? A minute? Eventually, I sat up. The shop was a wreck, covered in broken glass and oil, but the roof was intact. The street outside was moving. People were walking, rushing, ignoring each other, living their fast, noisy lives. I looked down at the watch in my hand. The second hand was ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Moving forward, wasting away, just like it should. I stood up, my knees shaking, and placed the watch on the counter. I didn't want it. I didn't want the quiet. Walking out the door, the bell above the frame jingled, a sharp, clear sound. I stepped onto the sidewalk and bumped into a businessman rushing past. "Watch it, Grandpa!" he yelled, not even breaking stride. "I will," I said, smiling at his back. "I will watch every second of it."